You here, despite travel challenges, despite this awful cold in Lviv yesterday, and despite last night's party, I'm glad that we all are here. So please make yourselves comfortable. And before we start, let me use my microphone privileges to quickly remind you a few safety points. There is still possibility of air raid alerts, regardless of any news about ceasefire, you know it. They cannot be turned out, so we'll hear them in this space, but we do not interrupt the event because we are in a secure location. In case of power cut, we also continue, because the venue is equipped with a backup power source. During the switch between systems, the light may go out for a couple of minutes. It's okay, please remain calm and keep seated. And in case of fire alarm, a signal will sound to a public address system, and the event will be paused. Everyone will be evacuated, and then we continue after the approval from the State Emergency Service. And please, before we start, also, my point is that we can never have too much gratitude. So let me say a couple of words about those who made our gathering possible. We are grateful to our core partners, the National Endowment for Democracy and International Visegrad Fund. We also express our gratitude to our event partners, UNESCO and the people of Japan, the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom, and the Federal Foreign Office of Germany, the Council of Europe. We are grateful to our contributors, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, Recover Ukraine Peer-to-Peer Journalism Project, Public Interest Journalism Lab, Andrei Hripta Charitable Foundation, and CAT-UA. And we are grateful to our media partners, our cultural partners, and to the Lviv City Council. And so now we are ready to start our first conversation of this day. And we start with a question. Today, democracies underestimate the threat posed by autocratic regimes. They look both the danger embedded in authoritarian agendas and the cracks within their own systems. And why have societies with long-standing democratic traditions, like the UK, the US, and several EU countries, become so vulnerable to a wave of political populism, which doesn't offer a genuine alternative, but instead erodes democratic institutions while selling the illusion of an impossible utopia? What will it take to reboot democracy, and who is capable of doing it? Please welcome our today's speakers. Aman Sethi, Editor-in-Chief of the Open Democracy media outlet and the host of the In Solidarity podcast, whose award-winning journalism has explored critical global issues, including migration, labor rights, land grabs, public hate, nationalism, and insurgency. Please, Aman Sethi. I also warmly welcome Timothy Garton Ash, British historian, professor of European Studies at St. Antony's College, Oxford University, and senior research fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. He has authored 11 books on European history, including the latest, Homelands, A Personal History of Europe, which has been translated into over 20 languages. Dr. Greg Mills, who directs the Bret Hurst Foundation in Johannesburg, working to boost Africa's economic growth, who has spearheaded reform initiatives with governments in Rwanda, Mozambique, Malawi, and South Africa, while also advancing peace building and investment efforts in Colombia and throughout Africa. Please, Dr. Greg Mills. And please also greet our moderator, Olesia Ostrovska-Liuta, who is art manager and curator of contemporary art, the Director General of the National Art and Culture Museum Complex, Mistetsky Arsenal, and also board member of the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy and the Health Solutions for Open Society Foundation. So please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to my brilliant panelists. I'm very happy that we can have this conversation today. I am very grateful to all of you who came to listen to this conversation at 10 a.m. on Friday, which is very unusual for many places. And today we're going to have a conversation which I think will consist of two parts. One part is our analysis of the state of the democracy. What is the state of democracy as seen from different places? From maybe such places as India or Africa, which is not a very well-known perspective to Ukrainians, or other perspectives as well, historically and politically. And what should be done to cure those maladies that we will maybe see in the process of this conversation. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you for joining this panel. You can applaud. So my first question goes to the historian, Dr. Timothy Garton Ash. How would you describe the state of the democracy today? Is it still the dream of every country? And is it as strong as we thought it was 10 years ago, maybe?
Thanks very much. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. This is my 7th visit to Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale war. And as always, when I come to Lviv, one of the things I always do is to go up to the Field of Mars, to the military cemetery, and see the growing forest of flags, as I did yesterday, and visit the grave of someone I had the privilege to meet, Yevgen Hulevich, who was a great local intellectual who died in the fighting in Bakhmut. But what that also reminds us of is the strength of democracy. Because not only were these guys dying fighting for democracy, but one of the main reasons Vladimir Putin launched the full-scale war against Ukraine is because he's afraid of democracy, right? So a Russian journalist, Konstantin von Eggert, says that the most important event in Russian politics in the last quarter century happened outside Russia. It was the Orange Revolution. And it was when Putin thought that democracy was coming towards him that he started thinking that he had, and in addition to his motives of restoring the Russian Empire. So let's start with the strength of democracy. And in a sense, Putin's war is a tribute to the strength of democracy. Moreover, in the last half century, we have seen an unprecedented spread of liberal democracy around the world. Let's remember that. According to Freedom House, in early 1974, there were only 35 free countries in the world. By early 2004, 89. Now, you can argue about the classification, free country, not free country, but that is an unprecedented spread of liberal democracy. Latin America, Southern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, other areas of the world. So part of what we're seeing is what I would call an anti-liberal and anti-democratic counter-revolution. It's a reaction to this unprecedented spread of liberal democracy with all its faults over those 30 years. 3 quick points about the ailments of democracy. So I've talked about the strength of democracy, because the populists, the nationalists, the reactionaries, the dictators are exploiting weaknesses of the democracy. 3 key ones. Number 1, identified already by Aristotle, the danger that democracy degrades into oligarchy. The great achievement of modern liberal democracy was to separate wealth and power. Most of human history, wealth and power have gone together. In oligarchy, they come back together. You know that very well in the history of independent Ukraine. You know all about oligarchs. But now, even in the United States, we see with Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and all the tech bros, Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and others lining up to support him, democracy degrading into oligarchy. That's point number 1, the danger of oligarchy. Point number 2, liberalism has created, in a sense, its own resistance, because what was associated with liberalism over the last 40 years, in particular neoliberalism, globalized, financialized capitalism, but to some extent also identity politics, left a huge part of our societies in countries like Britain or America feeling both economically and culturally neglected. And then the populists come along and they say, we hear you, we're on your side, and they counterpose democracy to liberalism, right? So they exploit the rhetoric of democracy against the so-called liberal cosmopolitan elites in the big cities, and they say, we are speaking on behalf of the people, except, of course, it's not the whole people. It's only one part of the people. In fact, Donald Trump at one point actually said, there's the people, and then there are the other people. And the other people are the bloody foreigners, quote unquote, the immigrants, the outsiders, the others. So that's point number two. Last point, very quickly, I'm sure we'll come back to this. This is a media forum. Democracy depends on having a certain kind of public sphere, a certain kind of information environment. Go back to ancient Athens, all the citizens meet on the pnyx, they hear all the facts, they can debate freely all the different policy options, and then together they decide to fight the invading Persians on sea rather than on land, which is how they win the Battle of Salamis, which is how they defended the world's first democracy. So you need a certain kind of public sphere for democracy to flourish. And what's happened over the last 40 years is because of the digital revolution in media, we have the phenomenon of both monopoly, Facebook, Google, and fragmentation, so that we are losing the kind of public sphere, the kind of information environment you need for democracy to flourish. So those are three, in my view, key ailments of democracy that we need to address.
So in your opinion, let me quote one colleague who is going to speak later today, Dmytro Zolotuhin, who about a year ago in a different discussion put a very provocative question. He said something like, Ukraine has been striving to be a democracy ever since it regained its independence. Aren't we, by chance, playing in the team of losers now?
Absolutely not. And these movements in history take time, right? So, as I said, you had an unprecedented spread of liberal democracy over more than 30 years. As a historian, one would expect a reaction, a counter-revolution, and that has now been playing out roughly since about 2007, 2008, certainly in Europe. And it still has some way to go because there are all these genuine discontents in our society. But do you think the autocracies and the hybrid regimes are delivering? Ask the people of Turkey. Ask the people of Hungary. Ask the people of Serbia. Why is it that hundreds of thousands of people are on the streets of Turkey and Serbia and Hungary day after day? Because autocracies don't deliver. So you're on the winning team. It just may take a bit of time for the victory to come.
That's optimistic. But Dr. Mills, over to you. How does that look if you look from Africa, especially when it comes to authoritarian regimes? Are people in Africa under authoritarian regime happy with them, as Dr. Ash has just mentioned, those who are not? What is the state of democracy if looked from that perspective?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I just want to say again how great it is to be here at the Lviv Media Forum as a kind of quasi-pretend academic. I attend many conferences, and this really is one of the best organized, best put together events from the perspective of a participant and a speaker that I've ever attended. Not that I've attended this year or attended in Ukraine, simply that I've ever attended. It's a credit to the organization and to Ukraine. And I think it's one of the notable features of someone who's been coming here for the best part of 25 years, but 12 times since the start of the full-scale invasion, of how Ukrainians have become so much better organized at virtually every level. Let me say one other thing, which is to be here with Timothy is a little like whose writings I've always enjoyed and whose interventions I've always found stimulating, is a little like playing guitar with Bob Dylan. I write songs in my spare time, and this is a song that I'll remember for some time. But to your question, as I said yesterday at the outset, 93% of Africans live under various forms of authoritarianism, as defined, as Timothy did, by Freedom House. But there has been, sorry, let me just counterpose that with the fact that Afrobarometer, which is an excellent African organization, has been polling Africans for about 20 years on their views on democracy. And about 70% of Africans routinely polled prefer democracy to any other form of government. So you have this contradiction. Africans want more democracy because democracy delivers. Why does it deliver? Well, it delivers at a variety of levels, not just human rights, of course, and less fear and repression, but it also delivers economically. And there's a stark correlation between democratic standards in Africa and the delivery of growth, as to go to Timothy's last point. The better the democracy, the longer the periods of growth in African countries, and the more sustainable those periods of growth. So there's much less volatility. So Africans prefer democracy. And we have been through, to his point as well, a tremendous democratic revolution since the 1980s. But it's kind of stalled. And it's stalled because it's difficult to deepen democracy. It's difficult to deepen democracy when there are those from outside who are trying to undo it. But it's also difficult to deepen democracy when there are vested political economic interests which want to retain control and retain the very structure of African economies since independence, which has been elite based, boom and bust, export commodity-driven type of environments, and those haven't really altered. When we talk about liberations in Africa, we talk about three liberations. The first liberation, which happened in the 1960s, was from people who looked like me, from Europeans, and they were removed from power, mostly in the 60s, but as late as 1994 in my own country, South Africa. The second liberation is when Africans booted out the liberators because they didn't deliver what they had promised, or they themselves resembled increasingly worse versions of the aim of the first liberation. And now we talk about a third liberation, which is a liberation from the old structures and ways of doing things, state-centered, elite-dependent, monopolistic in its practices, the oligarchic nature of the economies that Timothy referred to. So in 1980, there were just two democracies. One was Botswana, and the other was Mauritius, a long way away from the African continent. And today, there are about 10 African countries classified as free by Freedom House. The figure changes all the time, goes up and down virtually every year. About 25 which are partly free, and that group has increased substantially since the 1990s, and then about 20 which are stuck, 15 to 20 which are stuck in the unfree category, and some of those are regressing rather than improving. So overall, the African democratic condition has in fact worsened over the last 20 years, which I think it parallels very much what's happened in the world, but it's certainly not worsened by the standards of the 1980s. So we talk about a playbook, We talk about a playbook for elections. We talk about a playbook for change, that third liberation. And we talk about a playbook for the way in which opposition forces, whether they be government opposition or opposition as a check and balance within civil society, should act. And I think very briefly, I would just highlight 5 points in this playbook for discussion, which is the first thing that oppositions have to do is to get organized. And by that I mean they have to win elections. And we run an organization, we're the secretariat for an organization called the PAD, the Platform for African Democrats, which is about 90 African opposition leaders who meet on a frequent basis. And they are remarkably brave people. I mean, there are literally centuries together of political detention or of imprisonment among them. In fact, 2 of the leaders are currently in jail on trumped-up charges. The leader of the opposition in Tanzania and one of the leaders of the opposition in Uganda, both of whom have been held on so-called treason charges. So the first thing, they have to get organized and they have to win the election. And that's all about having a plan. It's about having, a message and policies that appeal to the population. It's about circumventing the worst effects of rigging. There was a South African judge, Justice Krichler, who said, only a fool rigs an election on election day. He's quite right. These elections are rigged in the atmosphere, in the general environment over a very long period of time. Media is a great leveler, but of course it's a great leveler for both parties, and particularly the state when they have control of government media sources. And as Timothy has said, this combination of monopoly and fragmentation is extremely difficult to counter. So the opposition has to have a very good, powerful, incentivizing message to the general population. The second point is briefer, which is that just as authoritarians have learned to stick together, think of the Friends of Steel, for instance. I think that's steel as in iron, as opposed to steel as in thieving, but it may be both, of course. Just as authoritarians stick together, Democrats have to learn to stick together as well. And actually, our little group of the Platform for African Democrats has been incredible in the way in which they have gelled around these cases of obvious government excess in the imprisonment of their fellows. I think thirdly, fundamentally, insiders have to want change more than outsiders do. So outsiders can support general directions, but they can't instigate them. They can't lead them. That's very dangerous and likely to backfire. And don't expect external solutions ever to work. I spent 4 tours in Afghanistan with the International Security Assistance Force, and am thus a confirmed skeptic about the value of aid as a change agent. As an agent for a means of reinforcement of local solutions, yes, but as a catalyst for change, absolutely not. Fourthly, this morning, interestingly, I serve as the strategic advisor to the President of Zambia, and this morning I was in SMS or WhatsApp contact with him about a range of issues. And he spent a long time, nearly 20 years in opposition before winning the election. And he reminds me that supporters and relationships are formed well before people get into office. That's when you get to know people. But he also reminds me that to win an election, oppositions have to win big. They have to win big enough that even rigging, even the populist card, which is routinely played, is not enough to be able to swing the balance. And as I said, the fifth lesson in all of this is you've got to have a plan, and that plan has to include a liberation beyond the election. The election is just a moment of change. It's a moment which offers possibilities, and of course you have to do that, but you've got to move and see this within a wider context. And for those countries, and I'm thinking particularly here, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, the Central African Republic, all of which have Russian forces working there in support of those regimes, which have come to power via illegitimate means, in most instances by military coups, there's a range of tools that can be used against them, not least reinforcing the opposition message, just as the Russians are reinforcing the messages of those various juntas. The Europeans should be turning their attention to reinforcing the messages of the local opposition movements, which they simply are not doing. Working together with oppositions on migration, finding means of protecting key individuals, and so on and so forth.
Thank you.
Overall, I would just say the glass is definitely half full, and the glass is really half full because of the fact that Africans have realized that it's up to them and that they, like Ukrainians, have agency.
Thank you so much for your final remark especially. I listened to you at the Kiev Security Forum just last week, and there you described and explained it to the audience, you and your colleague from the Brandthorst Foundation, how Russian influence in Africa works. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit later, but now I'd like to speak to Mr. Sethi. Mr. Sethi, you've been reporting across Asia, you've been one of the editors of Hindustan Times. What is your perspective? What is your take? What's the state of democracy and globally and also in India?
Thank you. I guess let's start with, there's a lot that's been said, and I think that, I guess one of the crises that we see in democracy today is also because I think all narratives need to be interrogated to some extent. And so perhaps I'm not a doctor of any sort, not a historian, but I think that if we start with ancient Greece, I think what we do know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there were a bunch of slaves in ancient Greece. And I think that when we kind of think about this idea of democracy, and we think about, for example, there's been this great expansion of free countries, the question, over the last 30-odd years, the question is free from whom, right? And the answer is free from Europe to a large extent. And when we think about the idea of these African liberation movements that have struggled to form sort of sufficiently democratic states or sufficiently non-corrupt states, again, it's worth asking what has been driving this? And I think, as we know, Western corporations, Western capital, Western politics have all played a huge role also in these spaces. I agree with the general consensus in this room about Russia and the USSR, absolutely. But I think when you think about the view from broadly what is called the majority world or the global south, I think one looks out at the powers that be and sees not many great options, right? So when you look at the world from the global south, you look forward and you also look at Gaza and you try and understand how international rules-based order can allow something like Gaza to continue day after day after day after day, death after death after death. So I think what this produces is a moment of great sort of confusion, I think, around this space. And what I do a lot of work on is actually kind of emerging and looking at the world through a strain of thought that kind of emerged out of post-colonial theory, which is, subaltern studies, which is you try and understand the world not necessarily through the prism of great empire or from power, but you try and understand what's actually going on in democracy from below. And I think when you try and think about what's happening in democracy from below, what you find is that we've seen a kind of post-war nation state, which is in some ways, I guess, seen as a given that every space, every geography in the world must now be governed by a form of a nation state. But my grandmother, for example, is older than the independent nation state of India, right? So when you try and think about this idea and you think that, okay, there's a certain idea of a nation state and it works in a certain way, and it'll work that way in India where there are 1.3 billion people, potentially more than all of Africa, and it must work also in Georgia, where there are like 2 million people. I mean, 2 million? 6 million people. It makes one kind of try and think, okay, what is the way that the world should work? And I think a lot of the ferment that we're seeing right now, and I'm not talking about Ukraine, this is my first trip here, I'm talking about the spaces that I am more comfortable with. I think the big question is for people to ask, what is this state form that governs us? And I don't think it is necessarily that the authoritarians are winning or the liberals are losing. It is that the state form itself is becoming more and more authoritarian. And I think the technologies of power, whether it's surveillance, whether it's ways of monitoring people, whether it's forms of extraction, whether it's the way that immigration law works, all of these suggest that we are, in a sense, trading parties on who gets to control an inherently authoritarian structure. So if you even look at the UK, where I've moved a couple of years ago, we now have a government that came in after 14 years of austerity, Tory rule, a government that's called Labour that professes that it stands up for rights. And if you look at their position on immigration, for example, it's surprising. So you have Europe trying to strike deals with Rwanda to ship out people. You have Europe striking deals with Albania to hold people who are failed asylum seekers. You have the externalization of Europe's borders to the edges of Africa, where they are paying governments to essentially patrol people. So for some people, the nation state is a site of liberation, but for some people, the nation state is also a prison. And I think in authoritarian regimes, it is a vast prison, right, that people cannot escape. So you have, to me, two kind of interesting strands that are emerging, which is on the one hand, you have people who are dying to fight to stay in the place where they are, and that could be like the battle in Ukraine, or it could be people in central India fighting to control their land while a mining company wants to take it over. And then you have people who are dying to leave their countries. And that would be the millions of people who have shown up in Latin America, who are walking across Latin America to enter the United States. That could be people catching small boats to cross the Mediterranean or the English Channel. And I think the fundamental challenge that we're facing and the crisis that we're confronting is that capital has been free to move and capital has been free to intervene while labor has remained locked in place. And I think that produces it produces the kind of craziness that we're seeing in country after country after country. In the 90s, there was a huge upsurge against globalization in the majority world because we were like, this is going to decimate our industries. And it was rammed through, including in Africa. Now, the genie of globalization has reached Western Europe. It has reached America. The deindustrialization that the Global South was terrified of, the devastation of agriculture that the Global South was terrified of, has now devastated the citadels of capital. And so now you have this situation where China produces 90% of the world's magnets, 80% of the world's Christmas ornaments, 500% of the world's air conditioners, and you now have the Western world in crisis as a consequence. So when we think about how does the Global South look at democracy, or how do you think about democracy when you think of these spaces? You think it's a cool idea. I think people are very invested in the fact that they have the ability to and the right to kind of intervene in a political process, but sometimes it feels a bit like a car where the steering wheel has been sort of disconnected from the wheels, So you're turning the steering wheel, and then sometimes the car goes in the direction that you steer, and you're like, it's working, and sometimes it goes the other way, and you're like, oh, actually, this is not working. Does that help?
Thank you for that metaphor. Dr. Ash, would you like to react?
Yeah, I'm really grateful to Aman for that challenge. Of course, if it's a self-driving car, you have no control at all, which is... listen, first of all, you're so right about Gaza. The virtual silence of European leaders on Gaza, on the atrocities that are happening there, the absolutely grotesque violations of international humanitarian law, make our complaints about Russia's treatment of Ukraine seem truly implausible. So there's a massive problem of double standards. They do come back in a moment, but and there is a massive problem of double standards in the entire history of liberalism. That is without question. The question is whether it discredits the essential ideal of equal individual liberty for all, right? So, hang on a second, you have a chance to come back. So, if you don't need to go back to ancient Athens. If you go back to 1800, we had this ideal of the Enlightenment, even in the time of John Stuart Mill, equal individual liberty for all, but it didn't apply to poor people, it didn't apply to slaves, it didn't apply to women, and it didn't apply to 80% of humankind. Right? There's actually a great book you'll know called Enlightenment Against Empire, which is how some thinkers of the Enlightenment saw this contradiction. But I think you would acknowledge that in the last 200 years, at least in European societies, we have been trying to get closer to a genuine realization of the ideal of equal individual liberty for all. Ronald Dworkin, the great American liberal thinker, says the key principle of liberalism should be equal respect and concern for everyone living in a country. And so my response would be, yes, we've fallen down very badly, both internationally and domestically, and that's why we're in trouble. But for me, as a liberal, it doesn't discredit the fundamental ideal of equal individual liberty for all, and I've yet to see a better ideal.
I mean, I agree with you. I think that I would certainly not be here arguing the opposite. And I completely agree with you. I agree with you on that point.
Well, having mentioned the weaknesses of the democracy, Dr. Ash, how do we heal the maladies?
Okay, so I think Greg had a 5-point program. Was it a 5-point program? Yes. Okay, so I'm gonna trump you. I've got 7, but they'll be very, very quick. Okay, first of all, tough on populism, tough on the causes of populism. It's really important to address those genuine discontents, that sense of economic and cultural neglect in large parts of our society. Secondly, strengthen all pluralist anti-majoritarian institutions, the independence of the courts, the civil service, auditors, obviously the different houses of parliament, and so on and so forth. These are the things that are coming under attack now, for example, in Trump's America, and have been eroded in countries like Hungary. Thirdly, learn from success. Poland, 2 years ago, was very close to going down the Hungarian path, to state capture, to the demolition step by step of liberal democracy. And they came back. How? By winning an election that was not wholly free and fair. More people turned out to vote than ever before, more young people than old, more women than men voted in that election. So mobilize, organize, learn from success. Number 4, the media environment. We are all losing the public sphere we need for democracy. Let's think very hard about how we regain it. It's not easy to find the answer to that challenge of monopoly and fragmentation, but one thing I can tell you, if you have public service media worthy of the name, hang on to them for dear life, strengthen their editorial independence, and quadruple the budget, right? One reason Britain has not gone the way of the United States and Poland is we still have the BBC, with all its faults. You in Ukraine have Suspilne, hang on to it for dear life, strengthen its editorial independence, quadruple the budget. Number 5, keep looking for what people have in common. You're going to have this problem in Ukraine in the next few years. When the hot phase of the war is over, and you're in a state which will be somewhere between war and peace, there's a big danger of all the tensions and divisions in Ukrainian society coming to the surface. So keep looking for the things that keep people together. One reason Britain has not gone the way of the US is that we do have some things that keep us together. I hope Aman will agree, as well as things that divide us. One of them is actually the BBC, because a lot of people still listen to these media, which are reasonably free and fair and where you hear all voices. Another is the National Health Service, right? A country that was totally divided over Brexit came together because we all stood on our doorsteps, banging saucepans and applauding the NHS. So look for the things that unite. Number 6, don't try to out-populist the populists. A mistake so many of our parties are making is to try and outdo the populists at their own game, be even tougher on immigration than they are. Aman just referenced it. I am horrified that Keir Starmer is giving a speech talking about not recognizing our country anymore and it being an island of strangers. It never works. We know that. If you adopt the rhetoric of the populists, if you do the dog whistle to the populists, voters will say, why should I vote for the dog whistle when I can have the real dog? It only strengthens the Marine Le Pens and the AFDs and the Nigel Farages. So don't try to out-populist the populists. Number 7, I told you I'd be quick. Don't collaborate, even in very small ways. This is the lesson of Václav Havel. I was talking to an American friend over breakfast, and she was describing some of the ways in which people, even in the United States, in the public administration, various walks of life, are already beginning to do these small acts of collaboration. As Havel always insisted, every dictatorship, every authoritarian regime isn't just built on force. It's built on these thousands and millions of tiny individual acts of collaboration. So don't collaborate even in the smallest way. That's the 7-point plan.
Mr. Sethi, as a journalist, could you talk a little bit on the role of media in this case?
So I'm a reluctant journalist. I practice it because I realize the power of media. I have a take on this kind of current moment that I think is sort of hopeful. My sense here is that, again, the BBC is an exception. It is an exception in that it is very hard to actually find state-run media in many parts, again, outside of Europe, that is truly independent. In many cases, state-run media, again, in the Global South, is not independent. It is the voice of, and I think, again, in this region, that will sound familiar. It is the voice of power. I think that the digital media, so I started off working in a 100-year-old, 150-year-old newspaper. I then worked for a while for BuzzFeed. So I've kind of worked on all sides of it. And I think that the digital genie is out of the bottle. And I think that's actually a good thing. I think that people talk about the fact that we no longer have one thing in common, people don't know what to believe anymore. But as I understand, again, from the histories of this region, which again, I don't know enough of, for a long time, there was just one voice in the Soviet Union of media, but people didn't really believe it, right? So I think that there's a way that while digital media certainly has a lot of problems, I think we're trying to come to terms with a brand new form. And I think when we try and come to terms with a brand new form, it produces the kind of chaos that we're seeing. I think that the monopolization point that Timothy made about the fact that there are just a few oligarchs, global tech bros who control the algorithms is a huge problem. But I think that when we think about the fact that we now have 1,000 shattered narratives, that's not always a bad thing. And I think that what it allows for is actually a lot more voices of communities within countries who have historically been shut out of conversations. In India, I'm thinking about specific communities who have been, for years, absolutely silenced, and now suddenly have a space to speak. So I think that there is a way that the current moment, especially for those of us who were, when I started my career, you wrote a piece, it went on the front page of a newspaper, it was delivered to 6 million doorsteps, and then you didn't have to think about who's going to read you. But now we know that world doesn't exist anymore. I'm not sure that's necessarily a bad thing.
Can I just add can I add a quick comment
Yes,
on that, if I
please.
may? Not a disagreement, but well, if you talk to journalists today, particularly younger journalists, one phrase you hear quite often is, I feel I'm, pardon my French, pissing in the breeze. Pissing in the breeze. I'm out there, putting it out there, and nobody's listening. So I'm absolutely with you, it gives a voice to the voiceless. But don't you also think, Aman, there's this real danger of such a fragmentation that in the end you don't quite know if anyone's listening?
So I used to think that, and the thing that kind of, the classic example that was given was reporting about climate change. Every time you wanted to write a story about climate change, your editors are like, no one reads that, we look at the analytics, no one cares. But it turns out the one thing that Gen Z is absolutely batshit crazy about is climate change. They are obsessed with climate change, as they should be. And so I think that, yes, journalists are feeling a diminishing of status. That's also not a bad thing.
That's an interesting perspective. Well, Dr. Mills, before we send the mic to the audience, would you share your opinion and your impression? Do you agree with the 7 points of Dr. Ash?
Sure, when did you stop beating your wife question? But I mean, there's nothing there that I disagree with, but I would add a couple of points, if I may.
Oh, please.
I mean, I think in Africa, which has probably got the biggest democratic deficit of any continent, there have been a few challenges, and let me just highlight 3. I'll deflate rather than inflate Timothy's contribution. And I think the first and fundamental one of these is that when our countries were liberated, in that first liberation, the liberators didn't really have a plan to do very much else. They had a plan to liberate quite effectively in most cases, very violently in some cases, with the support of external powers. Given the nature of European colonialism, it was usually the other side. It was the Chinese or the Russians. But they didn't really have a plan beyond liberation. And that plays into a second related factor, which is the fact that the choice that was made by elites and continues to be made by elites is essentially a choice for poverty. They choose poverty as a policy option, not because they want to make their people poor, but because it's the safest option for them. It's the one that keeps the elites happy, that keeps the system more or less intact, even if that elite is shrinking by comparison to everybody else. And I think that this relates to the fact that Africa has performed economically exceptionally poorly in the last 65 years. So in 1960, the average wealth per capita of an African was 30% of the global wealth per capita. So Africans were about a third as wealthy as the average global citizen. And since that time, that figure has halved. So we're now, on average, half as wealthy as the average global citizen, because we simply have not kept pace with what others have done in terms of their growth rates. But of course, our demography has changed dramatically from about 250 million people at independence to 1.2 billion people, 1.3 billion people today. And we are undergoing probably the greatest demographic revolution ever seen, which is projected to hit 2.5 billion people by the year 2050. So in the next generation, there'll be twice as many Africans on the continent as there are today. And of course, as a consequence of that, many of them will be young, many of them will be energetic, dynamic, highly mobile, and will be coming to a city near you because if they're not provided for at home, they're going to be on the march. And they're going to be on the march to Africa's littoral areas, to its coastlines, and particularly in places like the Sahel, where Russia is, of course, ensconced. They're going to be moving because you throw in a bit of climate change and regime instability, and you have dramatic population movements. And that brings me to the third point, is that a lot of this has been down to overextension by colonial authorities or former colonial authorities, and in particular, because we're going to call a spade here at the Lviv Media Forum, particularly France, which has sought to micromanage with a long stick at times its African colonies, and this has been increasingly rejected by populations and increasingly radicalized the policy solution in the form of military regimes. But this doesn't mean that Russia is going to do a better job. In fact, you throw in increasing amounts of repression, dollops of identity politics, which of course sit underneath many of these policy issues and choices, and in fact Russia's response of more repression, more military focus, more kinetic rather than social in nature, and you'll have an even worse outcome in a very short period of time. So the role of external powers has been very poor in alleviating these conditions, because the role of aid is not really about development. That's a bonus, side effect of aid. The role of aid is fundamentally about managing domestic constituencies in the country that is giving it, and it's a foreign policy tool with the elites in the country to which it's been given. Yes, there's some effect on the margins in the spending on democratic aid, if you want to term it that, which accounts for about, in any given year, between 7 to 9% of spending of aid overall, but far too much of it is spent on stuff which is bought in the domestic provider, or the services which are purchased, the salaries which are paid in the domestic provider, and then sent to a country of choice for a wider foreign policy goal, which is why it's so ineffective at presenting change, and which is why former colonial powers are often singled out for their lack of sensitivity towards domestic conditions. So, in part, it's a self-inflicted. In the main, it's a self-inflicted problem since independence, but it has certainly been aided and abetted by aid, which is just another version of expensive poverty. Thank you.
That's a grim perspective. Let's see whether we can get more optimistic with the questions. We have 10 minutes left, 2 or 3 questions we can take. Can you share one microphone, please? The man over there, then Dmytro Zolotukhin, and then third question here. Thank you, please.
Good morning to the gentleman. My question, you touched it at the end there, aid. Currently, we're facing a situation with US aid being, well, we know the situation, being stopped, both facing, well, giving us a bad situation in Ukraine, and you touched on it, in the global south, in Sahel, in Africa. What is your take on this right now, and how it may affect us, and possibly even democracy in these areas in the near future? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Mills, would you like?
Well, I think I partly answered it. I'm going to say something controversial, but I'm in good company here. So, I mean, aid has been a terrible way to develop. It's been an unmitigated disaster. Probably about $500 billion in aid spent in ODA spent this century alone. And there's very little to show for it if you look at the way in which African economies have grown. And it's spent largely on countries where it's wasted, precisely because the aid donors know that it's going to be wasted. It's an extraordinarily negative tautology. It's also spent in countries, in the main, like Uganda, where the political system is frankly despicable. And where the head of the army and the heir-elect of President Museveni, his son, tweets torture, or what do you say tweet anymore? Torture things on X. He sends out tweets about torturing opposition politicians in his basement. And yet they receive more than $1 billion in Western aid every year. And that's so-called strategic aid because of Uganda's role in the wider region and Uganda's and help for HIV and other sectoral aid projects within Uganda itself. But that distorts the link of accountability markedly between Uganda and its population. Most African Democrats don't like to talk about aid, and they don't like to talk about sanctions because it backfires on them back home when their own constituents are affected by cutbacks in aid. But they do know the effects because it buffers rogue regimes or authoritarian regimes. But it's an extraordinarily poor way to develop. But it's the way that donors and some academics and, of course, many governments prefer to see the solution. But even after many years of trying and many years of setting arbitrary benchmarks, in terms of percentage of gross national income as an aid benchmark, this has not really delivered. In part because it's being inserted into these environments where it's just simply not usable, and in part because the outsiders want the solutions, to go back to the point I made earlier, more than the insiders do. This is externally directed and driven. Now, finally, not all aid is bad. Humanitarian assistance, various other forms of assistance, in the case of Ukraine, military assistance, can be put to good ends. But again, Ukraine has agency where many of these other recipients don't have agency. And I think one of the, as I said yesterday, one of the great strategic lessons of this conflict is that the outside world has given Ukraine just enough not to lose, but not enough to win.
Thank you. Now, Dmytro Zolotukhin, please. I quoted him today, so he gets to ask a question.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. My name is Dmytro Zolotukhin. I'm head of an NGO, and Olesia was very kind to mention my name. And Professor Ash, thank you very much for your answers, but if I'm allowed, I would like to challenge you a little bit more on this, because a couple of ideas occurred to my mind when I was listening to you. And first is, it occurred to my mind that we had such kind of a category as expert of democracy. So expert of democracy. So if we have expert of democracy, so probably we have to have somewhere the production of democracy to export it. Plus, I think we have the expert of authoritarianism now. If we have the expert of democracy, then we have the expert of authoritarianism. And Professor Ash, you have mentioned that, if I'm correctly repeating you, that the Trump circles and MAGA people, they're using these appeals, populistic appeals, that they are representing the people. And they say that there are some other people. However, when you're saying that we have to be very hard on populists and we have to be very, very tough on Marine Le Pen, on Nigel Farage, on Alternative for Deutschland, however, don't we missing something when we're saying that because Mr. Trump came to power because of democratic elections? Marine Le Pen is, well, without these court decisions that don't allow her to run now on elections, she would be the next president of France. Alternative for Deutschland came to the Bundestag and they gained in power because of the democratic elections. And they are responding people for their requests. So maybe when we are saying about democracy, maybe something is wrong in production of democracy. that we cannot now export it. So authoritarianism is far better in exporting authoritarianism. And the resume is, if you will compare the development of G20 and BRICS, for example, you can see that BRICS is developing very fastly and very intensively.
Yes, thank you.
And BRICS is
Clear.
just the same community, but without Western countries. So maybe they are really winning now. Thank you.
Well, experts are very terrible people, I'm sure. But there's one thing worse than having experts, and that's not having experts. I would, if you've got them, hang on to them. Look, 2 quick points. One, in thinking about how we defend democracy, there is one school of thought, particularly strong in Germany. In German, it's called wehrhafte Demokratie, normally translated as militant democracy, which argues that you've got to prevent it right at the beginning, if need be, by banning them. So there's now a serious discussion of banning the AfD because it's an extreme right party. Marine Le Pen has been disqualified by a court from standing, at least for the moment, in France. I think this is a great mistake, politically. And you are seeing that right now in Romania, right? So they actually cancelled an election because of some very odd stuff going on TikTok benefiting Georgescu. What happens? Everyone votes for another hard-right nationalist candidate, Mr. Simeon, who comes out with 40% of the vote, and he appears at the polling station with whom? With Mr. Georgescu just next to him, and says he's going to be my prime minister. And I can tell you, you'd have the same effect with Marine Le Pen. If she's not allowed to stand, it'll be Jordan Bardella, and he'll appear at the polling station with Marine Le Pen, and you'll have the Le Pen vote and the Bardella vote. So I understand the kind of theoretical logic for it, but I think in practice, it's generally a great mistake. I think you have to defeat people politically, and not by that. Other point, and this goes to what you were saying, even if one subscribes to your analysis of the problems of development aid, and I'm not an expert on that, my colleague Paul Collier is, as you know, it's a terrible idea to cut USAID overnight. That is a seriously bad idea. People are dying because of what Donald Trump has done to USAID. And in Ukraine, I've been here for a week, I've met 3 people who've lost their jobs because of the USAID funding was cut. It's amazing how many areas of life it reaches. There is a danger. You should not confuse genuine civil society with NGOs, right? So there is a danger that you get stuck with foreign-funded NGOs for the next 30 years. We've seen that in Bosnia, for example. And the way to think about it, instead of getting proper grass like you have in an Oxford college, you just get astroturf. It's artificial grass. So there is a real challenge for a country like Ukraine going forward to move from what is necessarily foreign-funded, because where else are you going to get the support to it, to a genuine, resilient, lasting, homegrown democracy. And I hope that's what you'll succeed in doing, as well as winning the war in the next 5 years.
Thank you. I have to keep it brief. So please be very, very brief. Last question.
Thank you. My name is Salvador. I'm a historian at the European University Institute in Florence. My question is also for Professor Ash, and it's about human agency in history, Trump agency in history. Should we see this Trump politics weakening NATO, cutting the US aid as just a personal tantrum, as party politics, and in 4 years a Democrat president will turn the wheel over and restore the situation as it was until last year? Or these politics are telling us something deeper about the US decline, something deeper in a deeper shift in world affairs regarding the role of the US and and China, for instance, and what the Europeans should do about this, how the Europeans should react to this shift.
I'll be very brief because we're near the end of our session. Individuals definitely matter in history. It's not just long-term structures and processes, but it's always both. So there's a silly debate about whether this war is Putin's war or Russia's war. It's both. But you have to look at what elements are a long-term Russian imperialism and what elements are specifically Putin. Xi Jinping's China. Is it the personality of Xi or China? It's both. And it's the same with Trump's America. It's both. There's no question this particular ghastly, narcissistic bully is a specific problem and a major and bad historical factor. But there are also deeper long-term trends of American disengagement from Europe, looking to its own, returning to older traditions of American foreign policy. And therefore, don't let's kid ourselves that we're going to get our nice, right tight little transatlantic West back at the end of 4 years. We're not. Lesson for us in Europe, it's now up to us. If we want to defend ourselves and our democracies, we have to do it ourselves. If we want to defend liberal international order, it's up to us. So it's a moment of crisis for everyone, but it's a moment of opportunity for us. And for me, that defense of democracy, of Europe, of liberal international order, starts with helping Ukraine to win this war.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience. Thank you, everyone.